Hi, everyone. Welcome to your guest lecture on Global Feminism, Third World Feminism, and Transnational Feminist Networks. My name is Megan, and I'm presenting to you from unceded traditional Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, also known as Ottawa. And I'm really excited to delve into this topic with you because this subject is becoming ever more relevant as globalization becomes more and more deeply embedded in our societies. So like last time, I'm going to use my notes to keep me focused. Hopefully this is a better recording than my last one. It's also my fourth try, so wish me luck. Here we go. So feminism and organizing around issues of gender have been prominent in global activism for many decades, dating back to the early 20th century with groups that formed such as Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the Women's International Democratic Federation. These came about as a response to the rise in fascism in Europe, as well as at the end of two traumatizing world wars. So during the 1980s and second wave feminism, more educated, politically aware, and mobile women began networking at a global scale. So they started combining efforts in lobbying, information exchange, mutual support, and advocacy for various issues such as gender-based violence, nutrition, access to education and healthcare, as well as global peace initiatives. But as we've seen in previous lectures, though, these early feminist networks that gained prominent attention during that time in the early 20th century, as well as second wave feminism, were mostly led and organized by white middle-class women in the West, and often had racist, colonial, and imperialistic undertones to them. So while millions across the world were working to decolonize their countries, global feminist organizations were failing to consider the different ways that women and people across the gender spectrum experience racism, classism, let alone colonization. So to global feminists, though, gender inequality is obviously a global phenomenon. So to them, it makes sense for women of the world to unite and as one powerful force against this global phenomenon, patriarchy, for their collective freedom, liberation. And this sounds awesome at first, but they often reinforce neocolonial and imperialistic relationships with the communities in the global south during their charitable, advocacy, or development efforts. So since global feminism is centered around and led by the Western perspective, it's no wonder that global feminists really missed this mark. So during this time, criticisms of global feminism, which global feminism is considered to be white, Western, and liberal, these started to emerge, and they started to change these criticisms. A lot of it born from critical race theory, really started to change the way that some global feminists approach their work when they took those considerations to heart. So the first reading we'll look at is Under Western Eyes by Chandra Talpade Mahanti. And she puts it plainly. She says, sisterhood cannot be assumed based on gender. It must be forged in concrete, historical, and political analysis. Women and people of diverse genders experience different and sometimes contrasting forms of oppression that can sometimes be incredibly different to the Western experience. But most importantly, a lot of the economic, political, and social hardships that are experienced in the decolonized world is greatly due to the impact of European colonization, the aftermath, and our current neo-colonial economic world order. The global economy is set up to disproportionately privilege the Western first world countries at the expense of the third world. So this is the part where I'm going to address the use of first world, second world, and third world, what that construct was, and why we don't typically use those terms anymore. At the beginning of At the beginning of the Cold War, NATO countries essentially ranked the world's economies. Wealthy capitalist countries in the West were first world, the Soviet Union countries and communist countries were considered second world, and the rest of the world was either too poor or too chaotic to even participate, so they were dubbed third world, which is obviously an utterly insulting construct or designation to apply to half of the population, and the Soviet Union no longer exists. So, but Mohanty's text was written in 1984, and this term would have been used quite frequently. And today we typically say global south, because even as we say like developing countries, it's rather insulting considering how skewed the global economy is against them, against developing countries. So the reality is that we're in a world where we're going through some radical social change, thankfully. But with that, language is also going to change, and it won't come to a surprise if in a few years or down the road in the near future, pardon me, we have a more appropriate term to use instead of global south. And that is the beauty of progression. It never ends. We keep going forward. And and Mohanty indeed writes in her third endnote, I use the term third world with full awareness of its problems, only because it is the terminology available to us at the moment. The use of quotation marks is meant to suggest a continuous questioning of the designation third world. Even when I do not use quotation marks, I use the term critically. So it is with this notion that gender-based oppression affects women in different contexts in different ways that we can begin to understand and realize that we can't homogenize the global feminist movement and use a wide brush to paint the reality of women and people across the gender spectrum who live outside of the West. Mohanty writes extensively about colonization and the danger of allowing the Western world to not only define the experiences, but to also speak for women of the global South. Mohanty explains the implications, for example, of using women of Africa as a category of analysis. In this way, African women are put into a homogenous group of dependent or oppressed people, and then contrastingly, African men are painted as the oppressors. But this completely erases any other factor that goes into an African person's identity, such as their social location in terms of class, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, geographical location. And then on top of that, you also have to apply an accurate historical and political lens. So when you take an even deeper look at global feminism, and with that in mind, and also the global sisterhood as like a movement, you can really see the racist undertones, as this is centered, like the global feminist movement is centered around a white, Western, liberal feminist lens, which by nature focuses on individuality and personal autonomy at home in the West. Yet it categorizes millions of women in Africa as a homogenous group with whom they are meant to share some sort of sisterhood with, simply on the basis of gender. So in this case, individualism is granted to white Western women, but not to the women of Africa. Hence why Mohanty titled her text, Under Western Eyes. So Mohanty goes on to describe the different ways that that broad and homogenous lens of African women denies complex political, historical, and social context within African societies. So she goes on to explain the different stereotypes imposed on women of Africa, such as a category of analysis, and such are as universal dependence, married women as victims of colonization, women in religious ideologies, oppressive family relations. She goes into detail about those. And yes. So Mohanty also brings another very relevant contemporary example of the Western feminist gaze. And that is the habit that the West has of equating veiling in the Muslim world with male-dominated oppression, regardless of historical, cultural, or political context for that analysis. So Western feminist authors, she explains, would equate purdah, the segregation of men and women, with rape, domestic violence, and general sexual control. Mohanty responds to this analysis on page 347. She says, For example, it is well known in that Iranian middle-class women veiled themselves during the 1979 revolution to indicate solidarity with their veiled working-class sisters, while in contemporary Iran, mandatory Islamic laws dictate that all Iranian women wear veils. So while both of these instances, there are obvious reasons offered for the veil. One is opposition to the Shah and Western culture, colonization in the first case, and then true Islamicization of Iran in the second. The concrete meanings attached to Iranian women wearing the veil are different in both historical contexts. So Mohanty concludes that with this basis of analysis, it is that is taking historical, political, and cultural considerations, we can actually create effective political strategies in order for our justice movements when we bring those contexts into our analysis. So I have one more quote to bring it home. So on page 348, she writes in reference to the sexual division of labor and the devaluation of women. If such concepts are considered universally applicable, the resultant homogenization of class, race, religious, cultural, and historical specificities of the lives of women living in the third world can create a false sense of commonality of oppressions, interests, and struggles between and amongst women globally. But beyond sisterhood, there is still racism, colonialism, and imperialism. So I want to share a video with you about African feminisms or womanism, also known as Stiwanism or Nego-feminism, depending on the theory that you want to check out. But all of these are from the African context, and that's really relevant to what we've been discussing. Third world feminism is, surprise, surprise, not a total homogenous monolith either. And African feminisms and womanisms is, as you can guess, based on the particular experiences and interests of African women within their local context. So I'm going to share, without further ado, I'm going to share that video with you now.
Nairobi to Conakry, women across Africa are demanding change in attitudes towards sexual harassment, fair wages, access to land, and equal opportunities for political leadership. But they're doing it in their own way, says Gwendolyn Michael, professor of anthropology and foreign service at Georgetown University and author of a book on African feminism.
In the US, women often think feminism means I alone determine what's best for me. But African feminism is very much a different thing. It's about how women interpret their interests and empowerment within the context of where they live and their cultural values.
Feminism has historically had negative connotations on the African continent, says Shingarai Mutera, who teaches African feminist theory at Rhodes University in South Africa.
Feminism, one, is considered to be a title that is given to middle-class people or people who are white. There's also an attachment to feminism, that feminism is anti-men and anti-African cultural systems and anti-African traditional practices. So in that regard, there are many women who would hesitate to be identified as feminists.
Advocating for women's rights on the basis of equality of the sexes can be intimidating for some men, but American University professor Kweku Nwama says it shouldn't be the case.
And it starts with not being afraid of the word feminist and understanding that what's right for our women is right for us as a society, as a continent in general.
He says some of the problems require a shift in cultural attitudes, and those take a long time. But some countries aren't waiting. Rwanda, for example, has the largest share of seats in parliament in the world held by women.
Rwanda is a terrific example of what public policy can do to help women. They use quotas, and people say, well, quotas diminish the role of women. No, it doesn't. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you see countries like Tanzania, where the government says you can go to school if you're pregnant.
Dr. Michael says things are evolving on the continent.
I'd say beginning about 20 years ago, I began doing a lot of, having a lot of conversations with ordinary women who had been supporting various movements, for example, in South African ANC women. And what was fascinating is that these women used to say, I can't talk about feminism until we deal with getting rid of apartheid. Now what we're seeing is that these women are parliamentarians all across the country. They are trying to get land laws changed.
People like Kenya's environmental political activist Wangari Maathai and South Africa's anti-apartheid activist Winnie Mandela are seen as great feminist inspirations for Matero. But is being a feminist critical in the empowerment of women in general?
The simple answer for that would be no, because many women across the decades have done work that is feminist, what we would consider to be feminist.
She says the lack of the feminism label in some cases doesn't negate the credibility of their work. Mariama Diallo, VOA News, Washington.
So yeah, in the lesson notes, I'm going to add a couple of extra TED Talks on African feminism for anyone who's interested, because it's particularly being taken up these days by African youth, and they're leading a really fascinating social transformation within the continent. So definitely recommend checking that out. Okay. So enter transnational feminism, and we will explore how Ranju Sayadu Hare demonstrates the importance of third world feminism to transnational feminism. So third world feminism, she says, generates a reliable analysis of and recommendations for addressing third world women's multidimensional and complex oppression through a careful examination of their local conditions in their historical specificity. Third world feminism also respects the agency and voices of third world women engaged in diverse forms of local activism. And I want to refer to Hare's third endnote, where she too addresses the use of the term third world. She writes, third world is a term reappropriated by previously colonized peoples to represent their political oppositionality and resistance. So within this lens, third world feminism is a valid term to use when referring to the theory, but referring to the continent of Africa, for example, as third world would be considered derogatory today. If you were referring to Africa in a different context as third world, it would be considered derogatory today. So, because we're all part of the same world, one in the same world, and this construct suggests extremely different economic conditions, but the reality is that these disproportionate economic conditions are actually far more interconnected and reliant on each other than the construct would suggest. And I would even argue that the first world is actually far more dependent on the third world than they would prefer to admit, I assume. So Hare examines Mohanty's 2003 article. So Mohanty wrote in 2003 an article called Under Western Eyes Revisited, Solidarity Through Anti-Capitalist Struggles and Advocacy for a Transnational Feminism that Recognizes that the Diverse Context and Autonomy of Women All Over the World. So Hare argues that transnational feminism and third world feminism go hand in hand. And Hare explores how Mohanty begins to embrace transnational feminism as it emphasizes the idea of locality, local activisms, nationhood, and nation states, as well as it also emphasizes the entanglement of third world women, global capitalism, and third world nation states. But given the urgency of global alliances in order to resist this global capitalist agenda, which is fundamentally colonial, obviously, but racist and sexist, Transnational feminisms argue for a comparative relational feminist paradox that is transnational in its response and engagement with global processes of colonization. And Hare ultimately is arguing that transnational feminism needs third world feminism because we live in a world of Western hegemony. And if like that type of power is always going to be present for a long time. We have a lot of work to break that down. And what Hare is saying is that we need third world feminism really at the forefront of this transnational feminist movement, because it's too risky for them to be pushed to the margins again in the context of Western hegemony. So the impacts of colonizations are key reasons as to why third world was assigned to these economies in the first place. So it is a well-known fact that global institutions such as International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and even USAID represent the donor wealthy countries. Donor wealthy countries, and we can even refer back to that dependency thing that I mentioned. Who's dependent on who, yeah. And so these international bodies, though, can coerce structural readjustment programs, or also known as SAPs, on nation states of the third world as part of this capitalist recolonization process, the effects of which are devastating for the lives of poor women in these countries. SAPs are a set of regulations, or rather a set of deregulations imposed on countries by these large international monetary bodies in exchange for economic development loans. So if they open their economies up to deregulation and open up their natural resources and labor or other aspects of their economy in the spirit of free, open trade with multinational corporations and the promise of economic development, this has obviously failed to bring anybody out of poverty or bring significant development to these developing countries. In fact, the result of is the continued plundering of the global south's natural resources, the exploitation of working class populations in a capitalist economy that enriches the Western feminist sisters at the third world sisters' expense. So with this in mind, we can really see how calling countries in the global south developing is frustrating to say the least, as well as this notion of a global sisterhood. So how do we then apply third world feminism and transnational feminism combined? Thanks to globalization, communication and access to information has never been more available. And this can be harnessed by transnational feminist networks for the benefits of sharing information, resources, advocacy, and solidarity without erasing the specific localized context of the members within that transnational feminist network. So a great example of an effective transnational feminist network is called Women Living Under Muslim Laws, or WLUML. So I'm sorry to have to make you hear me talk through this example again, but I tried, I couldn't find a video about them. Definitely check out their website though. They formed as a committee in 1984 of 9 women. Now it extends to 80 different countries, and it was originally as a response to the application of laws and customs that are said to arise from Islam, but that resulted in the violation of human rights. So their goal was to create an international solidarity network to exchange information and mutual support, while also creating a collective space of solidarity amongst Muslim women living in different nation states, and therefore coming from different historical, political, and cultural experiences. So actions by this organization include efforts to repeal discriminatory legislation, efforts to enact legislation that is favorable to women, the publication of research and journalism, and they also do action alerts, which they send throughout their network. And these spread information about issues or specific cases pertaining to injustices within the network's localized communities. WLUML also must account for the diversity of different political and historical contexts of its member countries as well. So knowing that there are differences across the Muslim world over how to operate under Muslim law or how to interpret the Quran is something they keep as a foundational thought process within their operations. So in order to address this, in 1990, they started a project within their organization called Quranic Interpretation by Women, and where Muslim women within the network held many meetings over years to discuss multiple interpretations of the Quran and to discuss multiple interpretations of the Quran, and they ended up publishing their work in 1998. This allowed participants to see just how differently Islamic scholars and various schools of thought interpreted the same verses of the Quran. This in turn helped them create another project called Women in the Law Project, wherein women from 20 different countries examined the legislation and Muslim family codes that discriminate against women and indeed contradict the clauses in a country's constitutions regarding equality. So with the globalization of the feminist movement and Western hegemony, the Western perspective of Middle Eastern or North African feminism may be ethnocentric at best and downright racist at worst. And therefore, a transnational feminist network like WLUML does well to address the social justice issues within a context that they experience and understand. So this is a great example of a transnational feminist network that is working to ameliorate the lives of women living in the Muslim world, while also taking account the different political and religious fundamentality contexts of women involved in the network. So I'm going to leave a link for their website in the lesson notes, so you can check it out, because they are a really interesting group full of with lots of great material you can check out. So I want to finish with a TED Talk from 2009, and it will really drive the point home about the homogenization of the experiences of people across nation states and cultures. It's called The Danger of a Single Story by Nigerian-American feminist author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She is a critically acclaimed novelist, feminist, and LGBTQ advocate in Nigeria, and she's based partly in the US and in Lagos. For accountability purposes, I want to note that there was valid controversy surrounding something that she said about trans women in 2017, and I'm going to be linking information about that in the lesson notes. There is a chance that her words were taken out of context, and the resource I'm linking is pretty thorough in their analysis about it. So the TED Talk I'm about to show you, though, is about the risk of a single homogenous narrative imposed on people living in other parts of the world, and it's really insightful. So I'm going to start showing it now.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in Eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes, and we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, living domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet, Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. So I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. When I learned some years ago that writers were expected to have had really unhappy childhoods to be successful, I began to think about how I could invent horrible things my parents had done to me. But the truth is that I had a very happy childhood, full of laughter and love in a very close-knit family. But I also had grandfathers who died in refugee camps. My cousin, Polly, died because he could not get adequate health care. One of my closest friends, Ukoloma, died in a plane crash because our fire trucks did not have water. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes, the immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 people applied for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe, and it's very important, it is just as important to talk about them. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So what if before my Mexican trip, I had followed the immigration debate from both sides, the US and the Mexican? What if my mother had told us that Fide's family was poor and hardworking? What if we had an African television network that broadcast diverse African stories all over the world, what the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe calls a balance of stories? What if my roommate knew about my Nigerian publisher, Mukhtar Bakare, a remarkable man who left his job in a bank to follow his dream and start a publishing house? Now, the conventional wisdom was that Nigerians don't read literature. He disagreed. He felt that people who could read would read if you made literature affordable and available to them. Shortly after he published my first novel, I went to a TV station in Lagos to do an interview. And a woman who worked there as a messenger came up to me and said, "I really liked your novel. I didn't like the ending. Now you must write a sequel, and this is what will happen." And she went on to tell me what to write in the sequel. Now, I was not only charmed, I was very moved. Here was a woman, part of the ordinary masses of Nigerians who are not supposed to be readers. She had not only read the book, but she had taken ownership of it and felt justified in telling me what to write in the sequel. Now, what if my roommate knew about my friend, Fumi Yonda, a fearless woman who hosts a TV show in Lagos and is determined to tell the stories that we prefer to forget? What if my roommate knew about the heart procedure that was performed in a Lagos hospital last week? What if my roommate knew about contemporary Nigerian music, talented people singing in English and Pidgin and Igbo and Yoruba and Ijo, mixing influences from Jay-Z to Fela to Bob Marley to their grandfathers? What if my roommate knew about the female lawyer who recently went to court in Nigeria to challenge a ridiculous law that required women to get their husband's consent before renewing their passports? What if my roommate knew about Nollywood, full of innovative people making films despite great technical odds. Films so popular that they really are the best example of Nigerians consuming what they produce. What if my roommate knew about my wonderfully ambitious hair braider who has just started her own business selling hair extensions? Or about the millions of other Nigerians who start businesses and sometimes fail, but continue to nurse ambition. Every time I am home, I'm confronted with the usual sources of irritation for most Nigerians: our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also by the incredible resilience of people who thrive despite the government rather than because of it. I teach writing workshops in Lagos every summer, and it is amazing to me how many people apply, how many people are eager to write, to tell stories. My Nigerian publisher and I have just started a nonprofit called Farafina Trust, and we have big dreams of building libraries and refurbishing libraries that already exist and providing books for state schools that don't have anything in their libraries, and also of organizing lots and lots of workshops on reading and writing for all the people who are eager to tell our many stories. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her Southern relatives who had moved to the North, and she introduced them to a book about the Southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and the kind of paradise was regained. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Okay, so that is the conclusion on your lesson on global feminism, third world feminism, and transnational feminist networks. I will add extra links in the lesson notes about of anything I mentioned throughout the lecture, any text, extra vids, TED Talks about African feminism. I'll put them in. And thank you so much for listening, and happy Black History Month.